I'm very grateful to be here too, because I have a great admiration for the work that you do. And I have a great admiration for it for a number of reasons, but primarily is because, you serve others every day. And that's your profession. Like, you chose a profession of service. And not only that, you chose to serve people when they're in childhood, when we need service more than any other time. Because children are just people in waiting. And in a minute they change and they become adults. So the fact that you're serving people at that moment in time, is very special. So I don't take that for granted. And my hope is that for the time that we have, we'll be able to serve you in a way that you serve so many, right? And I'm wondering, how many of you have been in one of these presentations or a talk or a speech or whatever you want to call it, where it just stops? That hand went up way too fast. No, it was just awful, and you're just like, oh my God, when can I get out of here? And I was in one last week, and I started resenting the speaker for wasting my time. I'm like, oh my God, please stop. I was with my kids in church last week, and they had that look on their face. I said, no, we have to pay attention now. So how many of you have been there? Say yes. How many have been there? Say yes. Yes. Come on, otherwise you're lying. But also, let me ask you this question. How many of you have been in a talk or a presentation or a speech or anything where fundamentally what you heard, you may have heard one thing that changed the way you viewed your life? That changed your life, meaning one sentence that changed it, or one idea that changed it. How many of you can feel that? Say yes. Yeah. I'll tell you one for me. There's a story. You ever heard of a guy, Stephen Covey? Yeah. He wrote a couple of books. He wrote a story. He told a story once where he was on the subway in Europe when he was living here. And he got on the subway, and it was the morning, it was really early, and everybody's just kind of sitting there focused, reading their paper or whatever. And this man comes on with two kids. And the kids start running up and down the subway car. Imagine this at 7:30, 8 o'clock. And they're going crazy, and they're hitting people's papers. And the man's just standing there. And Stephen, kind of sitting there, and the way he tells the story, I'm not one to really have conflict. But I had to say something. I said, you know what? Excuse me, could you please get control of your kids? And he said, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't even notice it. He said, well, maybe you should. And the man said, I'm sorry, we just came from the hospital and their mother died. And I don't think they know what to do, and I don't know what to do either. And what Stephen said was, it gave him an understanding of the word paradigm. Somebody get me? I'm the first in 4 generations not to be in jail. I got to stay out of that. But it changed his whole paradigm. Meaning, it changed the meaning. And when I thought about that, the first time I understood the word paradigm, because I really didn't know what the word paradigm meant before that. But I also thought back to, at times, when people who I met changed for me the meaning. Changed for me the meaning. How many of you, when you think about that, can actually think of a talk or a time when that happened to you? Say yes. Yeah. One other thing that I'd like to share with you, you probably know this already, is that just during our time together, this question really fascinates me. I'm sure it fascinates you. And it's this question of how do you learn something? How do we learn something that we use? How do you learn something so that when a young person or someone you care about who's right across from you says something, you know what to say. You act. You do something. How do you do that? Well, I learned a while ago that you got to get into long-term storage. Did you know that? I didn't know that. Do you know how you get into long-term storage? Yeah, well, that's absolutely one thing. And you've got to get involved in the learning process, which is what you're kind of doing here today. And there are only two ways to get involved in the learning process. The first way is you use your voice, the way you're doing now. You use your body or your hands or whatever. And you use your emotion, right? That's the stuff you remember. Like, think about songs. How many useless songs do you know? All the words to. Why do I know so many Sir Mix-a-Lot songs that serve me no benefit in life? Because you use all this and tie to it. And the other thing is, you've got to share it. You got to share it with yourself, you got to share it with others. And I see some of you taking notes. And that's a great way to share it for others. Don't take notes from me. Take them with yourself because you share it with yourself. That's how, over the next, now we don't have a lot of time together, but the information that we're going to share, that's how you're going to get it so that you actually use it. Does that make sense? You guys into that? Because what we're going to talk about today is something that a lot of people really don't like to talk about. And I have a question for each of you. For you, not for your kids, not for the children that you have the opportunity to watch over, but for yourself. And that's this question. For yourself. Did you face any adversity when you were young? And you don't have to say it, but does anyone care to say it? Did anyone face any adversity in their childhood? Anyone care to share one? I'll share one. Anyone care to share one? We normally have a few. Because you know what? If you have one, do you know how many have two? 90%. So if you have one, you have two. Typically.
So, of course, being raised poor, that's one.
One, poor, black.
Witnessing domestic violence in my own home.
Me and you are like brothers.
And having to go for a place at the age of 10. So, like I said,
But yet you're here today.
yeah, that's what I learned.
It's so often that people who get into the business of helping others do it because that time no one was there to help them. What's your name? Thank you for sharing that, fellas. Anybody else? You probably have some of them.
Well, mine is back in the 40s, telling my age. But I came up going to race cars, and that was the hardest. And I was one of the families that my parents were mixed. My mother was Italian, German, and Indian. My father was black. And they were African. And I was 13, 14 years old when the kids were marching. But as a child, and keeping it up, it was hard because I didn't understand. How can people hate one another and don't even know it?
That's right.
Just because of their color, it doesn't make sense. You see color everywhere.
Yes.
You're supposed to have color. You see color in your life, in flowers, trees, everything. That's the way I learned,
What a fantastic meaning that you chose to give color. That you see in flowers and trees. Yeah, sometimes when the society does that to you, but yet you're here.
You're by the grace of God.
Because you have great faith. There are many of them, right? Whether it's you grow up in a home where there's lots of drugs and alcohol, right? From the parents, that's one. Sexual abuse, that's another one. Divorce, that's another one. Emotional abuse, terrible branded word, because some people think it's weak, but I found consistently it's one of the most damaging. Mental illness in the house, poverty, physical abuse. And then we got this whipping. You ever heard of whipping? I mentioned that last week. Some woman told me she hopes she doesn't catch it. We've experienced these. You've experienced them. The children who you have the privilege to touch have experienced them. And let me explain something to you, and you gotta understand this. This is the most important thing. You probably do understand already, but adversity faced in childhood is very different than adversity faced when you're an adult. Because when you're a child, what's developing? Everything. Nervous system, brain, body. You don't have the freedom. You don't have any physical capital. You can't lead. You can't do anything. Adversity faced in childhood is massively different than adversity faced when you're an adult. Does that make sense? Say yes if it does. Leading researchers in the world agree with that, but let me ask you this. If you did face this adversity, or if your kids, and when I say your kids, I say the kids that you have the privilege to touch, if they face adversity, it can either be the reason why they can't, or the unique reason why they can't. Because if you've overcome that adversity in childhood, what is it that you really can't overcome as an adult? What is it that really is going to pale in comparison? And I said that to this young person who's now a little older than this young person. And I'll tell you what she said, but I just want you to take a look at this first to see if you know what this is. Because a lot of people don't. But I think you might have experienced it. So that is the opening scene to a documentary that we did a couple years ago. And that girl was 6. And now she's 28. And I said exactly what I just said to you to her. Could you imagine overcoming that? But you know what one of the problems was? She didn't even know what to call it, that. Because what was that? Because she didn't know. What would she call it? Some people would call it, they call it domestic violence, right? Because that certainly took place. But when you ask people what comes to mind, when they say the word domestic violence, what comes to mind when you hear that word? What do you come to mind? First thing. First thing. What word comes to mind? You hear domestic violence, what do you see? What comes to mind? Abuse. Women, abuse, violence, beating. That's what comes to mind when you ask a lot of people. Children are not mentioned. You may say that it's child abuse, right? But when most people think about child abuse, they think about, like, physical child abuse. And that night, she wasn't touched. Even though in half of these houses, physical child abuse is, of course, present. Some people, again, would say emotional or verbal abuse. Absolutely. That was there, but there's even something more, right? The researchers, they call it whipping. Or child witness to intimate partner violence. 1% of people have ever heard of that. And then you've got this word, witness. It's a problematic word because the word doesn't do justice to the impact. So you got a lot of people that don't know what to call it. That girl didn't even know what to call it. So how the hell can you overcome something and you don't know what it is? You got to be able to name it first, right? And then, since they're not sure what to call it, we searched it. And we said to ourselves, let's search how many times people search for the word domestic violence to see if they knew what to call it, to prove it out, right? Can you see this chart? So this blue line is how often people search for the word domestic violence over the past couple of years. Do you see that big spike? Why do you think that spike happened? Because everything that happened like September, October, right, with the NFL? Right? That's why it happened. Amazing, right? It's like there was a buy one, get one spike at CDS. Wayne Reed. So at no other time in history, really, have we been searching more about domestic violence. Do you want to know why I know no one searches for children or childhood and domestic violence? Do you know why? Do you know where that is in the chart? Where anybody typed in the word domestic violence along with child or children or childhood? Do you know where that is in the chart? It's that red line at the bottom. That one. It's so low, it didn't even register a line. As a matter of fact, at its height, where that blue line is, there were 51 searches. We were probably 10 of them.
Or students. Doing our research.
Maybe they were. 51 of them. Is that really true? Really? For what UNICEF says is one of the most pervasive human rights violations in the world today? Impacting 275 million kids, some of which are adults in this audience. Who were these kids? Some are the 725 million adults who are amongst us today, 40 million of which are in the U.S. alone. Really? And you may say to yourself, well, all right, look, now that we're adults, we got like an adult brain. This isn't going to impact us anymore. This has no impact. Not the case. Some of the world's leading researchers, and we work with them all because they're all on our board, they say things like, you know, we're all too ashamed. This is so under society's radar that they don't connect the dots between the issues they faced growing up and where the life is today. Many of them, most of them, get away from the violence. But they're not able to live the life that they thought they were meant to live. And while some do, right, we have to keep in mind that more than half of these children are being raised by who? Like I was raised by my mother, like my mother's boyfriend was raised, like my mother was raised, like my grandmother was raised, right? Like lots of kids that you have the privilege to touch are being raised. Like many of you were raised. And they don't even know what to call them. So, the first thing that we can do is know what to call it. Because equipment sounds like a disease. Right? Doesn't it? A bad disease. And witness is an awful word. Because it doesn't adequately describe the impact. So, if you grew up living with domestic violence, you experienced childhood domestic violence. That's what they experienced. That's what that other adversity is. And this can be physical or non-physical. See what I'm saying? Physical or non-physical. I didn't talk to my mother about this until 4 years ago. And I only talked to her about it because I was writing this book and I said, Ma, they told me I have to interview you about like this. Do you mind if I interview you? She said, yeah, I do mind if you interview me about this. But I'll let someone else interview me, she said. And I really only had the courage to do it because the doctor told me that she only had 3 months to live. Can you relate to that? Why is it that we can only talk about some of these things when they're close to dying? Do we think that we're outing them? Are we tattling on them? Can we only talk about it when we know they're not there? I couldn't. I waited until I heard she had 3 months to live. So then, the guy gets on the phone interviewing her, and I'm on the phone on mute, on three-way. She didn't know this. So I was on the phone, on mute, listening. And the first question was, so Marilyn, what was your childhood like? And she said, oh, it was violent. And I swear, I was in my office and I'm sitting there, and I took my hand and I go, no, Ma. He's not talking about my childhood. He's talking about yours. I was on mute. And then I listened, and I began to cry. And I cried as though I was listening to my brother speak. Because I felt every drop of pain that she felt. She experienced the exact same thing. Some things even worse. But then she said something that really struck a chord. She said, you know, of all the physical child abuse, of all the drugs that were in the house, of all everything that was in the house, of all the CDV, even though she didn't know what to call it at the time, was in the house, I think that, you know, the words that they used to tell me who I'd never be, if they just didn't use them, I think my life would have been in a much different place. I think I would have been able to leave them because I just didn't feel I deserved anything better. Cried. So it can be, don't ever allow anybody to tell you that the non-physical isn't as impactful. Because I'm telling you, it is. Sometimes even more. And my mother, one thing she never did was she never told me who I would never be. Ever. It also doesn't have to last that long. Meaning, the duration in the home, right? Like even a brief stressful experience, a brief one, at this key time in development, can change the way the brain and nervous system form. There's a friend of mine who is in the book, and he's a friend of mine before he was in the book. His name is Jeremy. And Jeremy told a story that, you know, his father one day just came. There was a tremendous amount of child domestic violence in his house. Jeremy was really never touched physically. But one day, his father came to him and just lashed out on him with his words, telling him who he'd never be. And he looked up at him and he said, Dad, you know one day I'm going to kill you, right? You know one day I'm going to kill you. And the way he tells the story is his father stood there, he took 2 steps back, he walked out of the room, walked out of the house, never came back to the house. Never came back to the house. Do you know how old Jeremy was? Jeremy was 6. We only really become conscious right around like 4.5, really, with memories and such. That doesn't mean to last long. Now you probably say to yourself, well, Jeremy being 6, he certainly forgot about it, right? The shit. He did not forget about it. He started training. He would watch Spider-Man cartoons and practice and do the moves like Spider-Man was doing. He then joined the Navy. Oh, and his father kept sending him birthday cards every year. Love you. Love you. Love you, son. Never came back to the fight. Sent him cards. Jeremy joins the Navy and becomes a Navy SEAL so he can professionally train to kill his father. Do you know how many naval recruits grew up living with domestic violence? On average? Do you know how many, on average, military cadets, recruits grew up living with domestic violence? 49%. When you can't protect the most important people in your life, when you're little, maybe you can protect them when you're older. So Jeremy's about to do it. He's got a month leave, all planned out. He gets a call. The chaplain calls him into his office and says, Jeremy, I'm so sorry. Your father passed away. Where's all that rage going? Where's all that rage going to go? It's got to go somewhere. on someone who grows up facing these adversities in childhood? What's the impact? Well, I'll tell you, there are a bunch of them. But there's one in particular that drives the other four. One impact that has the most, or does the most damage. And that is this. It negatively wires a developing brain. It encodes a series of negative beliefs early in life that you often grow up believing. And this is really important to take note of too. That whether you really believe or not that you're guilty, that you're shamed, that you should have done something to stop it, that in some way it was your fault, or that, you know what, that I resent everything and everybody, or maybe you're just sad, or maybe you call it depression, or maybe you feel like you'll always be alone. Or perhaps it comes out like Jeremy, where he's really angry. Or maybe after the anger, we just go back to it's all hopeless. Because we really are just massively fearful of everything. We know that we're worth less. There is no sense of self-esteem. We're tremendously self-conscious because if you believe all the stuff about yourself, how can you actually see what others see? And who would ever love anybody like us? And the problem, my friends, is this, that if this gets encoded into anybody's brain early in life, whoo, you know, I only learned this a few years ago from the guy who wrote the book, How the Brain Learns. Do you know how the brain works? You probably do because you're in education, but I never heard of this simply. The brain seeks to find evidence of what it believes is true. If you write one thing down, or if you can just remember, or if you can text it or tweet it to yourself, just the brain finds evidence of what it believes is true. That's how it's designed. So if early in life you believed any of these things, your brain finds evidence as to why it's true. And on top of that, we act and feel in accordance, right, with who we believe we are. We really can't do anything other. We act and feel. So is it any wonder that people who grow up facing adversity in childhood have such troubling outcomes? Is it really a surprise that so many of them aren't even here anymore? The only reason I'm here is because a car pulled up. Bright lights behind me kind of surprised me. I didn't want anybody to know that I went out that way. Is it any surprise? Is it any surprise that we're 50 times more likely to abuse drugs and alcohol? Do you know what the point spread on 50 times is? It's like 100 points. 50 times. I heard this definition of happiness about 3 years ago, and I just love it, and I want to share it with you because I think you may too. Because it really is very simple. I thought happiness was about like cheerfulness and smiling. It's not. What it's about is this: are your thoughts pleasant most of the time? And only you know that. When your thoughts are pleasant most of the time, you're happy. If they're not, like they were in my house, drinking alcohol temporarily helps them get better. Me, I'm 74 times more likely to commit a violent crime than I have. That's why I was so worried about these two people.
Yes.
And then, you think about what happens in the prison population, 90% of prisoners came from these homes. But what about this ongoing issue that we're talking about, that we began this thing with? Because there's so much this talk about domestic violence, right? Remember that chart? Remember the chart? Do you know the single best predictor of whether you'll be in a domestically violent relationship? The single best? Anybody guess? Anybody? You know the answer. Whether or not you grew up in one of these homes. But yet you never hear anything about this, right? It's like if you were running the Lung Cancer Society of America and you never targeted cigarettes. But many of you are not. And many of the young people are not this yet, right? Right? They're none of those things yet. None of those statistics. Many of you are none of those statistics. Maybe you have some bad beliefs, but you're not those statistics yet. So what happened? How did that happen? Well, this is the second thing I'd ask you to consider and write down. Because the research is really clear on this. Do you know the pathway to resiliency out of one of these homes? The single thing that does it? The single thing that makes you resilient to get out of these homes is that someone stepped in early in life and shared with you a truth that you could not see for yourself. And the brain began to unlearn. Maybe someone said to you that, and I don't know who it was, but maybe someone said something as simple as, I hear you. I believe you. You're not alone. You know, it's never a child's job to control the actions of adults. And in that, your brain began to unlearn. That's why many of us are still here. But then there's this one thing that seems to be eluding us, which is, what if there was more to unlearn? Because that same guy that wrote that book, How the Brain Learns, he said this thing too. He said that people who grow up facing these adversities will not reach their full potential in life. Their full potential. What you and I were really meant for. Unless we unlearn all that we learned. And who was there to tell you that? Nobody really. But you can be there to tell others that. And I'm going to tell you the 10 things. The 10 things that we were really never told. And these are the truths. And that is that, no, there is no guilt. They're not guilty. It's never a child's job to control the actions of an adult. They didn't ask to be put in that home. The moment that they can begin to understand this is the moment that they actually begin feeling more free. And they can act in their best interest. They're not resentful people. They may resent what happened. They may resent the people who did it. But remember, when you resent, you can never have compassion for others. You can never have compassion for others until you have it for yourself. You can never have it for yourself until you know that this had an impact. Then you can have compassion for yourself. Then you can have it for others, because those who face adversity in childhood are amongst the most compassionate in life, because only those who suffered know what suffering feels like. You're not anything other than this. We're not sad. We may have sad moments because something was taken from us, our child, and that's sad. But the truth is, as these young people, and you in particular, as we get older and older, we see a pathway out of that house. We're not where we were. We see a pathway out of that house. And for that, especially now that we know that, oh, we have so much to be grateful for. Truly. This one is kind of a funny one. We all think we're alone. We're only alone because no one knows what to call us. No one understands how many people face adversity in childhood. They're more than they know. You can't trust yourself when you feel alone. You can't trust yourself until you know yourself. Once you know yourself, once we know ourselves, once they know themselves, they can begin to do what? To trust others. not angry people, and they're not angry. You're going to find a lot of angry people, and you're going to be confused by them, as I was. But anybody who's angry, they just, they learned a bad lesson. And here's the lesson. That anger is a really good way for me to get you to do what I want. And I'm going to teach you that lesson through my anger. Then you're going to do what I want. But we all know how that works for us. It doesn't really work well long term. What you can do is you can take that tremendous energy that anger produces, that tremendous energy, and point it towards the thing that you're most passionate about. Do you know who did that? Truly? Jeremy. That's where that rage went. Because that rage could have went in a lot of really bad places, right? The moment you think things are hopeless, you can hear what a lovely woman like this says, where, no, she's really more guided. Because you were guided out of that house. So were these kids. Fear and worthlessness comes up a lot. But this idea of worthlessness really stems from, I need approval of other people to replace the genuine lack of esteem that I feel for myself. But when they realize that the obstacle that you've already overcome, nothing else in life compares. Creates a tremendous sense of esteem of self. They realize that they're more accomplished than they know. This one, I don't know if it plagues you or not, but fear tended to stop me for a long period of time. I finally shared this with someone 10 years ago, because I had never shared anything about this 10 years ago. I finally shared it. And I shared it with a stranger, and I told him the whole story. And he asked me a question, and I said, who do you admire? He asked me that question. He said, who do you admire most? I said, I admire people with courage. He said, really, why? I don't know why I said it. I said, well, because I had none. Because every single night I would see my mother get hurt in my house, and try as I may to kill this guy, I never could. It happened every night. And the last secret that any man will ever tell you is this, that he was, as a boy, unable to protect the most important woman in his life. Because if you can't protect her, who good are you? And the guy looked at me and said, and I was on a plane with him, and like sitting next to me, he's like, I was just like making conversation. And he said, but I don't see it that way. I said, what are you talking about? You don't see it that way. I'm like, look, I grew up in a very peaceful house. I love my house. I have a peaceful house now. I can't imagine my kids even sleeping over your house for one night. What could possibly make you afraid today? What could you possibly fear after facing that in childhood? It spills a tremendous amount of confidence. This idea of many of the kids you're going to come in contact with are so self-conscious only because they believe this about themselves. As you help them unlearn, they can actually see how attractive they really are. And lastly, this one permeates a lot of different things. But the secret here is that as you begin to understand these truths for yourself and you give them away without expectation, the feeling that you feel is very, very, very good. So these really are the impacts, right? But if you begin to learn them and cultivate them and think about them, what's the impact now? What could the impact be? Well, the brain works in the opposite way too, right? If you actually begin to take these 10 things and we begin to cultivate them in, and we cultivate them into the young people that we have the privilege to touch, now all of a sudden, we can positively rewire a developing brain, right? We can instill a series of positive beliefs early in life, and then the brain doing its job seeks to find evidence. And in that, everything changes. all these patterns change. And you can tell them that these are the gifts that they were given for the price paid in childhood. These are the gifts that anybody who faced adversity in childhood were given. So I know this is a bunch to take in, and you guys have been in here for a long time. But you may ask the question of, like, what if they were now all of these things? What if we were now all of these things instead of that other list? And what are some of the things that we actually do? What can you do to do it? Well, the beautiful thing is the position that you're in is that you really are the one. In the same way that for me, a guidance counselor was the one for me, meaning someone who began to share with me the truth that I couldn't see for myself. That helped me begin to unlearn. You have no idea the impact that you have. You are that one for another. This is, I wanted to give you this. This is my email, my personal email at CDV. It's really simple. Brian@cdv.org. Brian@cdv.org. It comes directly to me. This is not in every presentation. I want to give it today because we have such admiration for the work that you're doing in the city. We're right here in the city. We want to be helpful in any way that we can. Anna is going to come up after me and just walk you through some of the discussion guide information that will give you more specifics too. But anything you need, please reach out. Just give me 1 second. Oh, no, go ahead.
4-year-old that his father killed.
If you have 4-year-olds that witnessed a father kill their mother, well, what I want to give you is something that's better than what I can give you in a 60-second answer. What I want to give you is access to an online training program that we created in conjunction with the leading researcher in the world and UNICEF, and is available on our site at cdv.org in about 35-40 minutes. You will have 15 different things. You will have 15 different things that you can do specifically with those children. But if I were to tell you one thing that never gets done, but it doesn't get done frequently enough, is that those children never have the opportunity to share. And they also never really understand, unless someone steps in and helps them understand, that, of course, the child is never responsible in any way for the actions of adults. As simple as that sounds to us adults, it's not to children. But please also email me if there's something personal that I can be helpful with. I want you to watch this one video that I think you'll like too. Tony Robbins. Have you ever heard of Tony Robbins? He is on our board. He's a very good friend. He's a great guy. He also grew up facing a bunch of adversity. And he grew up in one of these homes. He wrote the forward to Invincible, and he also recorded this in his message. I think we have like 10-15 minutes left. And what you have is you have a discussion guide for the book. And the discussion guide, we really wrote it to be self-explanatory to the extent that we want to address this issue a little bit more to the we spent a lot of time creating, and Anna wrote most of it. And what she's going to do is just give you just a brief overview of it, because I think we only have like 10 minutes left. Are there any questions, though, that we may be able to answer as we go into that? Anything else? And if any questions, too, please feel free to email them. So Anna will take you through that. Thank you so very much.